Hi, Year 3. Today we're reading chapter 10 of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, which is called The Spell Begins to Break. Just very quickly going back over chapter 9, we found out that Edmund had run away from the Beaver's house, and chapter 9 described him going towards the Queen's house, the White Witch's house, and telling her that he's heard Aslan is coming back. So now we're going to go back to Peter, Susan and Lucy and see what they're up to in chapter 10. So, the spell begins to break. Now we must go back to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and the 3 other children. As soon as Mr. Beaver said, "There's no time to lose," everyone began bundling themselves into coats, except Mrs. Beaver, who started picking up sacks and laying them on the table, and said, "Now, Mr. Beaver, just reach down that ham, and here's a packet of tea, and there's sugar and some matches, and if someone will get 1 or 2 or 3 of those loaves out of the crock over there in the corner." "What are you doing?" said Mrs. Beaver, exclaimed Susan. "Packing a load for each of us, dearie," said Mrs. Beaver very coolly. "You didn't think we'd set out on a journey with nothing to eat, did you?" "But we haven't time," said Susan, buttoning the collar of her coat. "She may be here any minute." "That's what I say," chimed in Mr. Beaver. "Get along with you all," said his wife. "Think it over, Mr. Beaver. She can't be here for a quarter of an hour at least." But don't we want as big a start as we can possibly get," said Peter, "if we're to reach the stone table before her?" "You've got to remember that, Mrs. Beaver," said Susan. "And as soon as she's looked here and finds we're gone, she'll be off at top speed." "That she will," said Mrs. Beaver. "But we can't get there before her, whatever we do. She'll be on a sledge and we'll be walking." "Then we have no hope," said Susan. "Now, don't you get fussing, that's a dear," said Mrs. Beaver. "But it'll be just half a dozen clean handkerchiefs out the drawer. Of course we've got hope. We can't get there before her, but we can keep under cover and go by ways she won't expect, and perhaps we'll get through." "That's true enough," said Mrs. Beaver, said her husband. "But it's time you were out of this." "And don't you start fussing either, Mr. Beaver," said his wife. "There, that's better. There's 5 loads, and the smallest for the smallest of us. That's you, my dear," she added, looking at Lucy. "Oh, please do come on," said Lucy. "Well, I'm nearly ready now," answered Mrs. Beaver at last, allowing her husband to help her into her snow boots. "I suppose the sewing machine's too heavy to bring, isn't it?" "Yes, it is," said Mr. Beaver. "A great deal too heavy. And don't you think you'll be able to use it while we're on the run, I suppose?" "I can't abide the thought of that witch fiddling with it," said Mrs. Beaver, "and breaking it or stealing it, likely as not." "Oh, please, please, please do hurry," said the 3 children. And so at last they all got outside, and Mr. Beaver locked the door. "It'll delay her a bit," he said, and they set off, carrying their loads over their shoulders. The snow had stopped and the moon had just come out when they began their journey. They went in single file, first Mr. Beaver, then Lucy, then Peter, then Susan, and Mrs. Beaver last of all. Mr. Beaver led them across the dam and onto the right bank of the river, and then along a very rough sort of path among the trees right down by the river bank. The sides of the valley, shining in the moonlight, towered up far above them on either hand. "Best keep down here as much as possible," he said. "She'll have to keep to the top, but you couldn't bring a sledge down here." It would have been a pretty enough scene to look at through the window from a comfortable armchair, and even as things were, Lucy enjoyed it at first. But as they went on walking and walking and walking, and as her sack began to feel heavier and heavier, she began to wonder how she was going to keep up at all. Then she stopped, looking at the dazzling brightness of the frozen river with all its waterfalls and ice, and at the white masses of the treetops and the great glaring moon and the countless stars, and she could only watch the little short legs of Mr. Beaver going pad, pad, pad through the snow in front of her as if they were never going to stop. Then the moon disappeared and the snow began to fail once more, and at last Lucy was so tired she was almost asleep, walking at the same time, when suddenly found that Mr. Beaver had turned away from the river bank to the right, and he was leading them steeply uphill into the very thickest bushes. And then, just as she came fully awake, she found that Mr. Beaver was vanishing into a little hole in the bank, which had been almost hidden under the bushes until you were quite on top of it. In fact, by the time she realised what was happening, only the short flat of his tail was showing. Lucy immediately stooped down and crawled in after him. Then she heard noises of scrambling and puffing and panting behind her, and in a moment all 5 of them were inside. "Whatever is this?" said Peter, sounding pale and hoarse in the darkness. "Hope you know what I mean by a pale-sounding voice." "It's an old hiding place for beavers in bad times," said Mr. Beaver, "and a great secret. It's not much of a place, but we might get a few hours sleep." "If you hadn't been in such a plaguey fuss while we were starting, I'd have brought some pillows," said Mrs. Beaver. It wasn't nearly such a nice cave as Mr. Tumnus's, Lucy thought, just a hole in the ground and dry, but dry and earthy. It was very small, so when they all lay down they were all a bundle of clothes together, and what with that and being warmed up by their long walk, they were really rather snug. If only the floor of the cave had been a little smoother. Then Mrs. Beaver handed round in the dark a little flask out of which everyone drank something. It made one cough and splutter a little bit, and it stung in the throat, but it also made you feel deliciously warm after you'd swallowed it, and everyone went straight to sleep. It seemed to Lucy only the next minute, though it was really hours and hours later, when she woke up, feeling a little cold and dreadfully stiff, thinking how much she would like a hot bath. Then she felt a set of long whiskers tickling her cheek, and saw the cold daylight coming in through the mouth of the cave. But immediately after that she was wide awake indeed, and so was everyone else. In fact, they were all sitting up with their mouths and eyes wide open, listening to a sound which was the very sound they'd all been thinking of, and sometimes imagining they'd heard during their walk last night. It was the sound of jingling bells. Mr. Beaver was out of the cave like a flash the moment he heard it. Perhaps you think, as Lucy thought for a moment, that this was a very silly thing to do, but it was really a very sensible one. He knew he could scramble to the top of the bank amongst the bushes and the brambles without being seen, and he wanted, above all things, to see which way the witch's sled went. The others all sat in a cave waiting and wondering. They waited nearly 5 minutes. Then they heard something that frightened them very much. They heard voices. "Oh," thought Lucy, "he's been seen. He's been caught." Great was their surprise when a little later they heard Mr. Beaver's voice calling to them from outside the cave. "It's all right," he was shouting. "Come out, Mrs. Beaver. Come out, sons and daughters of Adam. It's all right. It isn't her." This was bad grammar, of course, but it's how beavers talk when they're excited. I mean, in Narnia. In our world, they don't usually talk at all. So Mrs. Beaver and the children came bundling out of the cave, all blinking in the daylight, with earth all around them, looking very frowsty and unbrushed and uncombed, with their sleep on their eyes. "Come on," cried Mr. Beaver, who was almost dancing with delight. "Come and see. This is a nasty knock for the witch. Looks as if her power is already crumbling." "What do you mean, Mr. Beaver?" panted Peter as they scrambled up the steep bank of the valley together. "Didn't I tell you," said Mr. Beaver, "that she'd made it always winter and never Christmas? Didn't I tell you? Well, just come and see." Then they were all at the top, and they did see. It was a sledge, and it was a reindeer with bells on their harness, but they were far bigger than the witch's reindeer, and they were not white but brown. And on the sledge sat a person whom everyone knew the moment they set eyes on him. He was a huge man in a bright red robe, as bright as hollyberries, with a hood that had fur inside it, and a great white beard that fell like a foamy waterfall all over his chest. Everyone knew him because, though you see people of his sort only in Narnia, you see pictures of them and you hear them talked about even in our world, the world on this side of the wardrobe. But when you really see them in Narnia, it's rather different. Some of the pictures of Father Christmas in our world make him look funny and jolly, but now the children actually stood looking at him, they didn't quite find it like that at all. He was so big and so glad and so real that they all became quite still. They felt glad, but also solemn. "I've come at last," he said. "She's kept me out for quite a long time, but I've got it at last. Aslan is on the move. The witch's magic is weakening." Lucy felt running through her a deep shiver of gladness that you only get if you are solemn and still. "And now," said Father Christmas, "for your presents. There is a new and better sewing machine for you, Mrs. Beaver. I'll drop it by your house as I pass." "If you please, sir," said Mrs. Beaver, making a curtsy. "It's locked up." "Locks and bolts make no difference to me," said Father Christmas. "As for you, Mr. Beaver, when you get home you'll find your dam finished and mended and all the leaks stopped and all the sluice gate fitted." Mr. Beaver was so pleased he opened his mouth very wide and then found he couldn't say anything at all. "Peter, Adam's son," said Father Christmas. "Here, sir," said Peter. "These are your presents," was the answer, "and these are tools, not toys. The time will come to use them is perhaps near at hand. Bear them well." With these words he handed to Peter a shield and a sword. The shield was the colour of silver, and across it a rampant red lion, as bright and as ripe as a strawberry at the moment when you pick it. The hilt of the sword was gold, and it had a sheath and a sword belt and everything it needed, and it was just the right size and weight for Peter to use. Peter was silent and solemn as he received these gifts, for he felt they were a very serious kind of present. "Susan, Eve's daughter," said Father Christmas, "these are for you." And he handed her a bow and a quiver full of arrows and a little ivory horn. "You must only use the bow in great need," he said, "for I do not mean you to fight in battle. It does not easily miss. And when you put this horn to your lips and blow it, then, wherever you are, I think help of some kind will come to you." Last of all, he said, "Lucy, Eve's daughter." And Lucy came forward. He gave her a little bottle of what looked like a glass, but people said afterwards it was made of diamond, and a small dagger. "In this bottle," he said, "there is a cordial made of the juice of one of the fire flowers that grow in the mountains of the sun. If you or any of your friends is hurt, a few drops of this will restore them, and the dagger is to defend yourself at great need. You are also not supposed to be in the battle." "Why, sir?" said Lucy. I don't know, but I think I could be brave enough." "That's not the point," he said, "but battles are ugly when women fight. And now," here he suddenly looked less grave, "here is something for the moment for all of you." And he brought out, I suppose, the big bag at his back, but nobody quite saw him do it. A large tray containing 5 cups and saucers, a bowl of lump sugar, a jug of cream, and a great big teapot, all sizzling and piping hot. And then he cried out, "Merry Christmas! Long live the true king!" And he cracked his whip, and he and the reindeer and the sledge were all out of sight before anyone realised they had started. Peter had just drawn his sword out of its sheath and was showing it to Mr. Beaver when Mrs. Beaver said, now then, don't stand here talking till that tea's got cold, just like men. Come and help to carry the tray down and we'll have breakfast." What a mercy I thought of bringing the bread knife. So down the steep bank they went, back to the cave, and Mr. Beaver cut some of the bread and the ham into sandwiches, and Mrs. Beaver poured out the tea, and everyone enjoyed themselves. But before long they had finished enjoying themselves, and Mr. Beaver said, "Time to be moving on." Okay, so the children and the beavers have met Father Christmas, or Santa Claus as you might know him. He's given them some presents and some tools. What I want to know is, if you met Father Christmas, what do you think he would give you? What tools or presents do you think you might need? That's one job. Your other job is, we used a word in that chapter, and that word was solemn. 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 I want you to look at what that word means and tell a parent or someone who looks after you, tell that person what it means. Okay, so 2 jobs. Number 1, what would you get from Father Christmas? And number 2, what does the word solemn mean? And try and use it in a sentence. Right, I will be putting another video up on Monday morning, so I'll see you then, year 3. Until then, goodbye.